So this has led people around the world to ask, why did this happen? Why did Yoon spend months planning a coup? Well, there are a few reasons. First of all, he's extremely unpopular and he has faced charges of corruption. And there have been investigations going on into Yoon and his wife and some of his political allies over corruption, accepting bribes, and avoiding taxes. And there's also the fact that Yoon was basically a lame duck president. He only had a small minority in the National Assembly. His right-wing party, the People Power Party, only had just over 1/3 of the seats, and he never had a majority even when he won the presidential election. And yet in April 2024, the opposition won a supermajority of nearly 2/3, which prevented him basically from passing any legislation. So he said, screw it, I'm just going to have a coup, I'm going to declare martial law and rule as a dictator. And in the lead up to the coup attempt, Yoon was extremely unpopular. In the lead up to the coup attempt, a poll found that he just had 17% approval rating. And really, 2 months after coming to office in 2022, his approval rating fell to 30%, and it never really recovered. It hovered around 30% and continued to fall. And in December, disapproval hit over 80%. After the coup attempt failed, his approval rating fell even further to just 11%, an all-time low. Basically, the only people who support him are far-right extremists and some very rich oligarchs because they know that he'll serve their economic interests. And the reason he was so unpopular even before the coup attempt is because his policies have been against the working class majority of South Koreans, only in the interest of a small handful of elites. In January 2024, the South Korean media reported that he had pushed through a policy that would allow a 21.5-hour workday. That is not a typo. I did not misspeak. 21.5-hour workday. I'm looking here at an article in the Korean newspaper, the Chosun Daily, titled, "Working 90 hours per week, South Korean labor sector emphasizes unrealistic examples." This report noted that the Yoon government was trying to push through a policy that had a loophole that could lead to working up to a maximum of 90.5 hours per week and 21.5 hours per day. And this is what a lot of people around the world don't know about South Korea, because they see that this is a very wealthy country. It has industrialized, it has advanced technology. And many people say, look how prosperous and free South Korea is. But in reality, South Korea is entirely dominated by a small handful of corporate oligarchs. And South Korea was run by right-wing military dictatorships from its foundation after World War II until 1987. The first democratically elected president of South Korea was not until 1988. And even though Korea does have an elected government, in reality, its system is very oligarchic. Its economy is almost entirely dominated by what are known as the chaebols, which are these huge corporate conglomerates. I'm reading here from the New York Times, quote, "For decades, South Korea's economy has been dominated by a handful of family-run conglomerates that hold outsized wealth and influence and factor into nearly every aspect of life in the country." This report notes that the total sales of the 5 largest chaebols, these corporate conglomerates, have consistently made up more than half of South Korea's GDP, topping 70% in 2012. That is, the vast majority of all of the goods and services produced in South Korea's economy, the GDP, is made up by 5 corporate monopolies. And the New York Times notes, quote, "Their businesses also permeate South Korean life, from hospitals to life insurance, from apartment complexes to credit cards and retail, from food to entertainment and media, not to mention electronics," end quote. And these chaebol oligarch families have cozy relationships with politicians, and they basically run the political system. So this is not really a democracy. It's a corporate oligarchy. And yeah, they have elected leaders, but we can see how those elected leaders are now simply trying to overthrow democracy because they no longer even want to go along with the illusion of being democratic. So what was the response of the US government as one of its closest allies tried to dissolve democracy and create a military dictatorship? Crickets. The US government did not criticize Yoon Suk-yeol. They didn't say anything. All the US government said is, we support South Korea. We support South Korean law. They should abide by their law and resolve their internal disputes. They did not utter a single word of criticism of this US-backed leader who is trying to create a military dictatorship. And why is that? Because South Korea is a very close US ally and is basically militarily occupied by the US. In fact, South Korea has to pay for the US military to occupy it. This was reported by Reuters in October 2024. US-South Korea agree on 5-year plan to share defense costs. Reuters noted that there are 28,500 American troops stationed in South Korea, and South Korea has to pay some of the costs of the US deployments. They have to fund US labor on these military bases. They have to fund the construction of military installations and other logistics support. And they've been doing this since the 1990s. So paying for their own foreign military occupation. This is what the US calls freedom. And in fact, what's shocking is that the former US ambassador to South Korea referred to South Korea as a client of the United States. That's a real quote. I found this because a friend of the show, KJ No, who's a great journalist and writer, he noted that back in 1989, at the confirmation hearing for the former U.S. ambassador to South Korea, Donald P. Gregg, he said, quote, "As our relationship has evolved over the years, it has moved away from that of patron to client," end quote. So acknowledging that the United States treats South Korea as a client state. So given that the US government supported a series of right-wing brutal military dictatorships in South Korea over decades, from the 1940s until 1987, it's no surprise that still today, Washington supports these authoritarian leaders who try to dissolve democracy in South Korea today. And back in 2023, Yoon Suk-yeol was invited to give a speech on the floor of the US Congress. And in that speech, he bloviated about democracy, claiming that South Korea and the US are defending democracy.
Korea and the US have joined forces to safeguard freedom and democracy throughout the world. Since World War II, Korea dispatched its warriors of freedom. We fought side by side with the US in Afghanistan, Iraq, and others.
Note how he boasted that the South Korean military helped the US military invade Iraq and Afghanistan in wars of aggression. So this is what freedom and democracy means. It means helping the US invade other countries. But what was especially ironic about this speech that he gave on the floor of the US Congress is that he warned that today democracy is at risk because there's the rise of false propaganda and disinformation. Listen to these hilariously ironic remarks made by South Korea's wannabe dictator, who was claiming to be the defender of democracy just a year before he tried to launch a military coup and imprison and potentially assassinate his political opponents.
Our democracy is at risk. In many parts of the world, false propaganda and disinformation are distorting the truth and the public opinion. They are threatening democracy. Such totalitarian forces may conceal and disguise themselves as defenders of democracy or human rights. But in reality, they deny freedom and democracy. We must work together and fight the forces of falsehood and deception that seek to destroy democracy and the rule of law.
By the way, after this coup attempt failed, Yoon Suk-yeol changed tactics, and instead of blaming North Korea, he tried to blame China. And he claimed that he had to impose martial law because he had to crack down on Chinese spies who were threatening South Korea. So once again, we can see that this loyal US ally, the reason that Washington loves him so much is because they were trying to use him to try to weaken China. So they don't care. I mean, go ahead, launch a military coup. As long as you are a loyal US ally who will help fight against China, the US will support you. That's the message that we get from this. And if you go back and look at what think tanks in Washington, D.C. have been saying about Yoon Suk-yeol in recent years, they're very open about the fact that they want to use him to isolate China. And this is bipartisan. It's not only Republicans, it's also Democrats. In fact, the Democratic Party-aligned think tank, the Center for American Progress, published a hilarious article in 2022 titled, "Rising Anti-China Sentiment in South Korea Offers Opportunities to Strengthen U.S.-ROK Relations," and has a big photo of wannabe dictator Yoon Suk-yeol and Joe Biden together. So they were very clear. The U.S. should work with these far-right anti-democratic leaders in order to isolate China. This is the new Cold War strategy. And while many people in Washington love Yoon Suk-yeol, they don't like the South Korean opposition leader, Lee Jae-myung. And why is that? Because they portray him as being soft on China. Because the leader of the Korean Democratic Party, which is not very left-wing, center-left at best, but they don't want to provoke conflict with China, and they also don't want to provoke conflict with North Korea. They want peace and stability, unlike the far right, which tend to be extremely pro-US and very anti-China. And in fact, the leader of the Korean Democratic Party, Lee, the opposition leader, he has said that it's unnecessary to form a military alliance with the US and Japan. Instead, he wants South Korea to be more pragmatic. That's the term he used. He doesn't want to provoke conflict. And due to this very pragmatic attitude, the ruling right-wing party in South Korea, the People Power Party of Yoon Suk-yeol, which is very pro-US, they accused the Democratic Party and its leader Lee of being subservient to China. So once again, so much of this is about China. The far-right Korean hawks are the most pro-American of all of the politicians, and the left-leaning members of the Democratic Party simply want South Korea to be independent. Now, Lee is not in any way saying that we should break our alliance with the US, we should kick out the US military occupiers, not in any way. There are people on the left, the revolutionary left in South Korea, who are calling for that, the anti-imperialist left. No, he's still very moderate, but because he's not just a complete US puppet, he's portrayed as subservient to China. And in fact, pro-US conservatives in South Korea have spread a lot of fake news and disinformation on social media, including they made a fake photo go viral in which they photoshopped the opposition leader Lee bowing down to a statue, a bust of Mao Zedong, which is just ridiculous. This is the kind of childish Cold War propaganda that the South Korean right wing has been spreading on behalf of their loyal US imperial overlords. And in terms of the geopolitics of the situation, another key player is Japan.